Hello and welcome to the Northeast Georgia History Center livecast. I am Marie Walker, the Director of Education.
And I'm Leslie Jones, the Archives Manager.
And today we are going to be answering your questions from the Suffrage live stream.
So Marie, when did you start being interested in suffrage?
I think the first time I had ever heard about women's suffrage was in an American Girl doll book. Samantha's aunt, Aunt Cornelia, was a suffragist in America, in New York, during the early 1900s. And I think it's really interesting because sometimes I think about the American Girl doll characters that I grew up loving, and most of them wouldn't have been able to vote in their lifetimes. Samantha would have been the first one who would be able to vote. She would have come of age right about, I think her first election probably would have been the first election. I don't remember when her birthday is. I don't have that much, don't remember that much knowledge. I'm sure I did at one point as a child, but I think that's really, really interesting. And that's definitely the first time I heard about it. And I remember the peek into the past that they have in the back of the books. And after they introduce Aunt Cornelia being this kind of, it was kind of a, not completely accepted. She's a high society lady, and was very popular for high society women in America to get onto that suffrage train and promote that. But also there was some some pushback from the older generation as well, who was like, why do you want this? So what about you? When did you first hear about the suffrage movement or become interested in it as a area of study?
So I was in my undergrad and I was taking a Reconstruction class, and we had to do a research paper on any topic in Reconstruction. And I thought a really interesting topic was women's suffrage because it wasn't very much talked about, more this aspect of what happened after the Civil War, not what happened with women after the Civil War. And I thought it was really interesting. You know, we look at all of these iconic figures from the suffrage movement and we just, go with what we were told, but through the research I found so much more interesting things. I think some of the misnomers that people have about women's suffrage, at least in America, is that the biggest contribution was Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I mean, they did help out a lot, but they weren't the contributing factor. It took over, I think, 60 years after they helped with the movement to actually get it passed.
They never actually got to vote.
No. I mean, Susan B. Anthony did try and vote and got arrested that one time, but she didn't actually get her vote to count. So
they never could legally vote.
Right. Did anything like that happen in British suffrage?
Usually the two leaders of the British suffrage movement that everyone thinks of are Emmeline Pankhurst and Millicent Fawcett. And some people have some very strong feelings about Pankhurst, which we will be talking about in a little bit, because she did some controversial things. So I think some people, I can't speak for British people. I am very much a Southern American lady, but it seems like, at least perceptions from this side of the pond, is Pankhurst a hero, or was she a destructive terrorist? And I think that's a question that you can't necessarily settle.
Emmeline Pankhurst did help with the American suffrage, though, remember? Because she helped inspire Alice Paul to start a militant approach in America, too. So she did actually help with American suffrage, at least in a good way.
So thank you so much for your questions during the suffrage live stream, and we are going to dive right into those right now. So the first one that we received that we are going to answer was this the time when women started to wear pants?
I can say from what I know in women's history is that it was more prevalent in the 21st century, 20th century, but there was a woman, Emily de Châtelet. She actually helped discover the squared and E = MC². She wore breeches which I don't really know much about, but I know you do. So what are breeches?
So breeches are a kind of short pants. So it has two legs, and they come and they fasten right below the knee. When you think of the founding fathers and all of what they're wearing, they're not wearing long trousers or pants. They're wearing what would be the style of breeches. They are high-waisted and have a fall down front, which carried over into the early pants. They didn't have fly fronts until the mid 1800s. And usually there is you have your stockings that then go up to your breeches, so your legs are still completely covered, but one of them is the knee high stockings, and then, or the ones that they really go over the knee and then fold down and have garters, and then you have the breeches that meet those stockings right below the knee.
So when she used to ride horseback, she would ride with breeches instead of a dress, and she wouldn't ride side saddle. So it was very controversial at the time, but she was an aristocrat. So I think that kind of helped her too.
You can get away with a lot when you're an aristocrat, it seems like.
For sure.
So that's one of the, I wouldn't say the first instances of women wearing pants, but it is definitely one of the most notable, and pretty far back. It's when you don't have photography and you have a very limited amount of no one's describing, and then I wore pants today in their diary. It's hard to figure that out, but there is a long history. You have Joan of Arc, who was actually burned not for witchcraft or anything, but actually for dressing like a man.
I didn't know that.
Yes, that's the actual reason why she got
I didn't know
burned.
that.
Yes. They accused her of a lot of things, but the one that actually got her burned was dressing like a man. So there's a long history of women wearing what is quote unquote men's clothing, but then you have a lot of pushback from that, as in getting burned at the stake, or if you're an aristocrat, maybe you can get away with it, but I'm sure a lot of people questioned her as to why and what and her motives. And perhaps got banished from high society or whatnot.
She hid Voltaire in her home, so she was already an outcast for harboring a fugitive. So essentially, it didn't matter at that point. She was doing science when women weren't supposed to. She was wearing pants when women weren't supposed to. So she was already a rebel from the get-go.
Nice. Going into the Reform movement, so when people think of the Reform, not necessarily Reform, well, it's the Reform movement, it's the Reform dress, but it's this Reform dress started at the beginning of the suffrage movement in America and was popularized by Amelia Bloomer, even though she's not the one who actually came up with the style, she's just the one who made it famous. And that is this kind of long tunic jacket that goes to the knee, and then bloomers or trousers, but they're poofy. When you think of bloomers, or that's pretty much, I think, what people think of is those long poofy pants that Amelia Bloomer popularized. And this was almost synonymous. A lot of people in the American imagination made this dress synonymous with people who wanted women's suffrage and suffragists. That's not necessarily true. As we know, with a lot of things in the press, things get blown out of proportion, and kind of a false narrative might be created. A lot of suffrage women who wanted women's suffrage did indeed wear a bloomer dress, and people who wanted reform and to have more mobility in the way that they were working wore bloomer dresses. Dr. Mary Walker was known to wear a bloomer dress because it was more practical when she was performing surgeries during the American Civil War. Dr. Mary Walker would also be known to wear a man's suit as a woman and cut her hair short, as I believe another woman, Victoria Woodhull.
Right, we had discussed her in the talk earlier, as Victoria Woodhull used to dress like a man, cut her hair like a man, because she didn't believe that women should be subjected to specific standards of beauty or physical appearance.
So were women wearing pants during the women's suffrage movement? Yes. Did it become common practice? No. These were rebels. These were women who were very much highly rejecting societal norms. It did not become the societal norm for women to wear pants. until about the 1950s or 60s. Really the 1960s, maybe even the 70s. And that's after you have the sexual revolution, you have the second wave of feminism, you have the civil rights movement, even though that didn't really have to do with pants. But you have a very large amount of societal change within that period after World War II. You could also argue that women started wearing pants during World War II because of their factory work and working on farms and driving tractors and taking over what were traditional men's jobs. This also happened during World War I, but the pants didn't really stick. Women really returned more to dresses, at least women's fashion did. But they were flapper dresses and they were much shorter, and you still had this whole fashion revolution as well after the two world wars. So I think you could argue that women started wearing pants during World War II, and then it didn't really stop. They didn't go back, but it also didn't become completely popular and accepted until the 1960s, 70s. I know my mom, when she was going to elementary school, had to bring a note from home if she was going to wear pants.
My mom was not allowed to wear them at all whatsoever until high school, so
it has not been that long since pants for women were very much accepted. Our next question is, what was one of the biggest revolts for women's suffragism?
I know in America there wasn't necessarily revolts, but there was a riot in 1913 when they were going to march on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. All these women dressed up and marched down the street, and men went over the barriers and attacked them. Over 100 women went to the hospital, and the cavalry actually had to be called to stop the riot. So it wasn't necessarily anything in America anyway that was very violent or protest such things, but there were a couple of violent incidences that actually helped further the amendment, because President Wilson actually saw it and realized what was going on and how detrimental it was.
In Britain, again, the suffrage movement, I don't think really resorted to riots. It kind of happened. They were peaceful protests that then men and police started to attack women, and therefore it turned violent, but not necessarily because the women were instigating the violence. One of the biggest, most notorious ones in England was Black Friday, which happened in 1910. And again, it was really women going to protest in what you would think is a peaceful way, and then police and male bystanders went in and started to attack them. Some of the attacks were of a sexual nature, and it's not necessarily documented incredibly well, but 2 women possibly did die of a result of injuries. They did die several days later. It's just how, if you can trace it back to their injuries at the Black Friday incident, is hard to do. But that would be the largest quote unquote riot that happened during the British suffrage movement.
So I think we could say that women never instigated anything incredibly violent, at least in protests.
In protest form.
In protest form.
There was, Emily Pankhurst did incite some violent acts, which we are going to talk about next. Because our next question is, since the British suffragettes resorted to acts of terrorism under Pankhurst's leadership in the pre-war period, do we know whether any government ministers or ordinary people were killed or injured as a result of these attacks? Which is a very specific and perhaps already leading question, because you are already saying that Pankhurst was indeed a terrorist or resorted to acts of terrorism. Historians like to debate that, if she was indeed a domestic terrorist or not. She did indeed incite different acts of destruction, but they weren't necessarily violent against people. So she was very much for damaging public property, but she also was very insistent upon not harming people. So one of the most famous things that her and her people did was blow up post office boxes, or these pillars that they would then put in, and smash store windows, break windows with hammers and or rocks. And then there were a couple officials whose houses they tried to destroy, either by bomb and or fire, but those people were not hurt. I think it's hard to justify bombing a person's house and say you weren't trying to hurt them, and unless you knew that they weren't home, which how do you know? So they did not kill anyone. There is no documentation of them killing any person, and Pankhurst herself was very adamant against violence against people, but rather just for the destruction of public property. And I guess she decided that some government officials' homes were not private. Again, I'm not sure how you would decide that, because usually those would be considered not public property.
Imagine she was just assuming.
I guess. So, yes, some people do believe that Pankhurst should be classified as a terrorist, and other people say no, she wasn't, because she wasn't inciting violence against people. It was just against public property. But I think it's really hard if you're just going against public property. How do you know you're not going to hurt anyone? It's a sticky situation. It's a sticky question. People have been debating it for 100 years, and no one has completely... There's not going to be a complete 100% right answer and or wrong answer, as in a lot of things in history is complicated. But we do know that there are no documentations of anyone dying.
So our next question is, what were different religious denominations' reactions to the suffragettes and the suffrage movement? Marie, I think you've done some extensive research on that. What do you think?
It's complicated. It's very complicated.
That sounds about right.
There were anti-suffragists who used religion as a reason for why women shouldn't vote, as I believe you talked about in our last live stream. But then there were also suffragists who thought they should vote, and it would be a morally good thing to vote and a religiously moral right thing to do to vote. So you have two very much people who are both of a religious mindset who think it's the complete opposite way. Denominations, the question did specifically ask about different denominations' reactions to suffrage movement. Most denominations did not make... As a whole, as a denomination, did not make a blanket statement about how they felt about that political issue. It doesn't really exist. If you wanted to go church by church by church, I'm sure different preachers had very different feelings about the matter, as do, if you think about modern politics and different church leaders, you have a medley of different opinions as well. I think if you really wanted to look into it, which I did, you can kind of see general trends in denominations, and one of the denominations I looked into the most was the Methodists. And actually, we always talk about the Seneca Falls Convention, and it was held in Seneca Falls, but what building was it held in? It was held in the Wesleyan Chapel, which is a Methodist denomination named after John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, or the reform movement of Methodism within the Church of England. So you see that church, which is Methodist, was very pro-women's suffrage. They allowed to have the first large women's rights convention in the United States held within their sanctuary. Therefore, that leads me to believe at least that church was very much for it, and possibly that denomination was more open to it. If you really want to look into how denominations treat women, you can look and see when did they allow women to start having leadership positions. And a lot of denominations began to start letting women hold leadership positions and or attend their general conferences. I'm speaking predominantly to American Protestant denominations at the moment. And that's around 1920. You have the Nazarene denomination, which has always welcomed women into their general conference, at least they depending on, and welcomed women preachers as well. I believe the Methodists or United Methodists also started to welcome more leadership positions into that time. But again, it takes much longer for them to be appointed into higher leadership positions. You have the Baptists, especially the Southern Baptists, who were very not welcoming to women in leadership positions at the time and moving forward. So you have a lot of different, but then you also have about 500 different subsets of Baptists as well. So it's really hard to go through all of the different denominations and say exactly what their specific views were. There were more ones that were more pro and ones that were more against. Methodism as well, because that's the one I did my deep rabbit hole dive down. You actually have a woman by the name of Frances Willard, who is the first woman to have her statue in the United States Capitol building, or in the specific area in the rotunda of the Capitol.
Oh, wow.
And that's because of her work in the women's suffrage movement, as well as her work in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Sometimes we think of women's suffrage as being its kind of own little category, but really it was also, you had the temperance movement, which was against alcohol and led to the ratification of the Prohibition Amendment, which happened very, very soon after women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And those two groups work together a lot, and you have a lot of overlap in that. You also have a lot of overlap in the Prohibition movement, you have the women's suffrage movement, and you have the abolition movement. So these large societal reform movements have a lot of overlap, and then also not a lot of overlap. Or you have some people who are very much pro just one, or dedicate their lives to just one. But there is a good deal of overlap in all of those societal organizations who are working for the betterment of what they believe to be a better society. And Frances Willard was one of those ladies who was very much on the forefront of a lot of those different movements, and is actually honored in the United States Capitol, which I thought was really cool. When I went on a tour there, I realized she was the only woman, and so I wanted to ask about her, because they kind of just were like, and then here are statues. I'm like, okay, but this one, what about her? What did she do? Because obviously she seems important, and I have no idea who she is. But then I looked her up. So, yes, complicated.
I will say that as we were talking about spiritualism before and how it helped the suffrage movement, spiritualism was a part of Christianity. So if you believed in God and you did spiritualism, you were also more likely as a suffragist. So it really went hand in hand with religion. So I think a lot of people were for the suffrage movement, at least women in that religious aspect. And I think when men saw women as spiritualists, they knew they were suffragists, and most of the time were okay with it. Most of the time. Thank you so much for your questions. I know we really enjoyed it, and we hope to see you soon.
And don't forget, if you make a $5 donation to the Northeast Georgia History Center, you too could be entered to win this lovely suffrage sash with the different colors of one of the women's organizations that helped get women the right to vote. And it says Votes for Women, which was the slogan for pretty much the whole suffrage movement in America and in Britain. Here we do have the American colors. But please be sure to go ahead and to give that $5 donation. You have to make your donation by August 31st, because the winner will be announced on September 1st. You can also give more than just $5, because the more tickets you buy, the more chances you have to win. So if you donate $20, that's 4 chances to win. Bye!